Over the past year, I have had the pleasure, along with several other lawyers from Vincent and Elkins, to work with Paul and others at ERM to sponsor a number of roundtable discussions among company representatives, largely in the energy industry. Now, we just had a presentation on all the litigation that happens in just one portion of that industry. So you might worry that if we did that, the room would look something like this. And so we had a theory that, well, let's find a topic where there's a common foe. And of course, the common foe for particularly the fracturing industry is risk. How do we manage the risk that is inherent in this industry? And so we set up roundtable discussions. We gave people scenarios. We walked through them. And the end result looked a little more like that. We all got along well, and we all really learned a lot. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is what lessons we learned. I will add, we did serve alcohol at these roundtables. That might have helped with this result a little bit, but nonetheless, we learned a lot. So I'm going to invite Paul up here for a moment to give us a kind of a brief review of the client perspectives on the challenges of risk in this industry over the past year.
Thank you, Tom. Good to be here. Alcohol probably does help a little with risk mitigation, or at least perceptions of. So if you look back at what Tom's first slide was, where there was a ruckus, one way to think about it is that there was a lot of cost cutting going on, a lot of layoffs going on, especially from the 2014 to the 2016 period. And many of those cost cutting measures were so deep and steep that it was very hard to do it in a rational way. And so what that ended up with was real concerns on the front line that there's going to be risk emerging down the road as a result of less resources and less staff to be able to do stuff. What we think of that is essentially is the potential for an exchange from reductions in CapEx and OpEx to a risk X type of expense that may come up down the road. And so the first slide is really the tension that got created around a lot of those decisions that were made back then and what could possibly be happening. The next slide, showing people coming to harmony, I guess, is really about some of the insights that are starting to emerge on how to deal with risk, especially environmental health and safety risk, in ways that will continue to show great returns to the bottom line. So just a little bit from the client's insights, which we will touch on. One of the secrets that we're hearing back from folks in these forums is that to create a sense of union between operations and environmental health and safety practices and policies and procedures is really key. Bringing that stuff to the front line helps a lot. It's clear that operational excellence is leading. How can EHS play a piece of that? And the other piece that we'll touch on is EHS is a value creator if you treat it that way.
What we heard was several really interesting comments and questions that came from the clients. And one of them was this one. When we presented them with a scenario that basically was, okay, we've got a significant budget cutting exercise here. What are you going to do as a director or manager of safety and risk issues? And we got asked the question, how do you know you're right in choosing which costs to reduce and activities to eliminate and are not increasing the enterprise's operational risk? That's a tough question. And the great thing about doing these roundtables with Paul is that when I got asked a tough question like that, I would go, Paul, what do you think? So, Paul, what do you think?
The clients have the best answers to this thing. Tom, can somebody advance to the next slide? Thank you. One more time. So we've come up with a simple model on how event-driven risk can happen. Of course, there's systemic type risk and event-driven risks. We're only talking about the event-driven risks. What inevitably happens is if something in the industry or in a company happens that is a significant event. And what we find is that the folks that are in charge, senior management says, get the right people in here to make sure this never happens again. And so what we find is that there's an increase in headcount related to people who are knowledgeable and experienced about making sure this risk doesn't happen. That inevitably leads to an increase in the systems and processes and controls to make sure that those are in place and that this event is mitigated should it ever arise. Next. Then another event happens. In this case, you could say the economic downturn that occurred starting in around mid-2014. And what we find then is that the head count especially will come down, but the systems and processes do not come down as fast. And so you end up with essentially a resource gap between the things that are on the books that you should be doing and auditing against on environmental health and safety and the resource capacity that you actually have to do that. There's some good news in all this. And again, this is insights that is coming out from research as well as from the forum events. Spending more money on HSE does not necessarily equate to better performance. With this graph, really wants us to focus in as where are the green bars. And so what you see is for a number of different sizes of companies defined by different sizes of operating assets, how much are they spending in just terms of dollars on HSE per full-time equivalent? And what you can see is that the smaller companies have a potential to be on the higher spend side and not be getting that traction that they need on overall health, safety, and environmental performance. Somewhere in the middle, you'll start to see that the green bars are more prominent as assets build up. And that's really where we're trying to get to is something like 250 to 300 looks like it's the right level of spend and how to balance that out. Next slide. Here's another headline that we think means a lot, especially to the E&P folks. You can't add more expertise and build up your knowledge base and drive performance either. There's a diminishing return, just like in everything. So what this graph shows is that, again, the green bars is where you want to be. It looks like somewhere around 15 HSE FTEs per 1,000 operational staff is the right number across different size companies. That yields the best overall performance.
Okay, so as Paul said, you can't really spend yourself out of the problem, and you can't just staff it up and go from there. So what do you do in these circumstances to improve your safety program? And what we've heard and what we kind of developed from these discussions with clients is this, kind of a mantra in some ways: stop, prioritize, and simplify. And I'm not so much going to draw your attention to what's in the shading. These are ideas just to give you examples of what we're talking about. But with regard to the stop, it really is, what we heard a lot about were safety managers who suddenly had to deal with being the security manager at the same time. They were distracted, frankly, and not doing as good a job, and it was increasing cost. And we had a lot of overlapping different safety programs that had come up through all this kind of progress that had happened. And now when you've got less staff, it's hard to get it all done. Sometimes you need to prioritize. You need to think about what is the most important, what resources you have, and can you simplify the management of your safety systems. And then simplify, streamline, and maybe standardize too might be a good thing to add there. One thing we did hear a lot about is a lot of safety managers saying, I spend so much time in committee meetings that I don't really get much done. Audits and inspections. Bottom line is the energy industry is auditing itself to death. Ask litigators like Mark about how much he loves pulling up audits and looking at them and seeing issues that have been raised but haven't been addressed. We really need to rethink some things about audits and how we are spending money. What we've seen here is from clients estimates on savings. Following this simple process, and I say it's simple, easy for me to say that, but overall savings of about 35% price or cost reduction in their safety. So all of that is a good thing. Now, I thought another interesting thing what happened was one of the clients at one of these roundtables said, I was at a cocktail meeting with our board of directors, and one of the directors was talking about these issues that we're talking about, and he asked the question, how do you know you're right in choosing which costs to reduce and activities to eliminate, and you're not increasing the enterprise's operational risk? And the client's answer, I thought, was really good. It is embedded in the equality of our processes and our people. It's part of our DNA. Of course, that then begs the question, how do you get that into your processes? How do you make that part of your DNA? Again, that's a tough question. So again, I go to Paul. How do you do that, Paul?
Click forward. So if it may be too soft for some people to say it's in our DNA, here's another way of looking at it. There are a lot of leading and lagging indicators that are available for HSE performance. And what we've done recently is we went across the 2016 sustainability reports for a bunch of companies and looked at what people are measuring. And the message essentially is that lagging indicators are getting most of the press. So you can see up here on this particular summary slide that there are a lot of different indicators. 2 in green are potentially leading indicators. These are really helpful, especially leading indicators, because they give us an idea on how to avoid risk expense, so to speak. And what we'd like to do is to just drill down a little bit more on what some of these leading indicators could possibly be.
What I really want to talk about here is the employee involvement and the leadership program issues. Besides being an OSHA lawyer, I'm also an employment lawyer, so this really kind of rings with me. And what I have seen is those companies that do the best in involving their employees in their safety system, and then empowering those employees to the point where they feel somewhat of a leadership obligation in terms of making sure the safety program is being observed, feeling free to report issues, feeling like they will be heard and that actions will be taken. It's amazing how improved a safety program can be when that is done. And so I think it's something that we all need to concentrate on in this industry and really think through about how that gets achieved. So now what we want to do is talk about these lessons that we sort of learned here and turn to a risk issue that is very current for the fracturing industry. And that, of course, is silica. Obviously, we all know that this is an issue we have to deal with. I got a prop, actually. Anyway, as you know, the NIOSH has done a study and found that there were high levels of respirable crystalline silica in several activities around the fracturing operations, and I've listed several of those here. Of course, one reason this is such an important topic is that this is an industry that often is attacked. Larry talked about many of the outside sources who would like to come after this industry and frankly shut it down. This is another issue that can be a rallying cry about this, because people drive by, they see, like in this photograph, an employee standing out there what looks like a whole lot of dust, and they think silica. Now, we all know that that's not silica all around this employee, but that's not necessarily the way they'll play it or the way that we'll be attacked. And so it's an issue that we had to look at, and it's an issue for a long term too, because silicosis is something that, if not properly handled, could be the next asbestos of our lifetime, and there could be litigators who are going to make a living based on this if we as an industry don't get this right. So let's talk about what's going on the regulatory side. I think probably all know that OSHA has a standard on silica applicable to fracturing operations. It actually went into effect in June of 2016. It hasn't really been enforced because the big stuff under this regulation doesn't come in place until June of next year. That's when all the record keeping, training, medical surveillance, all of that is going to come into play. Now, some of you may be saying, well, we've got a new administration in Washington, D.C. Surely this is going to get shut down. Well, there is litigation also pending in the D.C. Circuit Court where the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and several other employer groups have challenged this rule. Oral argument in that case was heard last week. First off, I can tell you, having listened to that oral argument, the lawyer for OSHA, if the Trump administration doesn't think this rule should go into effect, the lawyer for OSHA didn't get that memo because she did an excellent job of arguing this case and about why this standard should be upheld. Also, y'all might remember a judge by the name of Merrick Garland who didn't quite get onto the Supreme Court. He was one of the justices of the three on the case. He, along with Judge David Tell, see very similar in their view on regulatory compliance and enforcement. That's 2 out of 3 votes right there. I can also tell you that the other judge, who's a little more conservative, Karen Henderson, didn't sound like she was going to be any friend of the employer side on this one either, because she at one point said, isn't it true that the most prevalent chronic disease in the world is silicosis? So my prediction is, and it's always dangerous to make predictions, but my prediction is this rule is going into effect and no court's going to stop it. And the current presidential administration has no stomach to stop it. So come next June, this industry will have to comply with this standard. Now, one thing I've shown here is I've got these vials, a picture kind of distorted, but to give you just a perspective here, what I've got up here are some vials, and one is just the mesh sand that's used. The next one is respirable silicas. So I'm being very careful with this because I don't want to have to do medical monitoring on Larry over here. And then the other three are the levels that we have to meet in order to comply with the OSHA regulation. And you got to get really close to see those amounts. And so we as an industry are really going to have to go to some thought and some work here to make sure we can comply with this standard. And in particularly when the engineering controls come in 2021. And what that means is in 2021, putting respirators on employees in order to meet the standard will no longer be acceptable. You have to have engineered this problem away. Now, I'm heartened because I hear people like Craig talk about all the technology that's coming along in this industry. So I have faith in you all that you're all going to come up with a solution to this one, and we're all going to be happy in June 2021, but that's the job ahead of us. So you take this issue of silica and exposure and what's coming down the pike, and you think about it applied to the lessons that we've learned in these roundtables. So what does that lead you to? And that's what I want to turn over for the conclusion of our presentation for Paul to tell us about that.
ERM had a pleasure of participating with a company that's expert in getting dust out of the air control technology at the well sites. And the hypothesis was that isn't getting the dust out of the air good for economics just straight up, and the potential liability reduction would just be added benefits on top of it. And so we went after that hypothesis and looked at engine oil data. We interviewed people that are in charge of fleets of diesel engines, looking at diesel engine life, looking at wear and tear in the field, and tried to slice this 5-6 different ways to really figure it out. So what we found out is that the economic benefit from simply getting the dust out of the air for all operators almost pays for the dust control. I mean, the control standards that get down to what you would need to comply with the OSHA standard by itself. And so that hypothesis held up in this regard. Not all operators are created equal. Some have very good maintenance programs, have very good engine life, have low capital costs. We estimated in this particular case study that they would be saving close to $1 million by getting the dust out of the air. On the other end of the scale, companies that did not have the same rigor around operation and maintenance procedures and follow through, maybe had shorter engine life, saw even more, almost a factor of 2 times the savings, close to $2 million in this particular study. When you consider that the cost of taking the dust out of the air is something like $3,000 a day, I don't know if that holds true with a 20,000 horsepower, 50,000 horsepower frac or not, but if it's something like that, it just seems that the economics are really in the favor for doing this, and then getting all the benefits on the backside from not having to worry about industrial exposure and measuring silica at your site. Next slide. So if we go back and we say this is really about driving operational excellence and embedding HSE performance into the front line, and getting dust out of the air is a good example of how to do that. What might it look like with respect to leading and lagging indicators? So this is just a quick, fun little exercise here at the end. In this particular situation, we've got an analysis that says we have a high potential rate as a lagging indicator. Maybe there's a lot of dust in the air at a frac site. If you look at leading indicators in this particular example, we are getting a lot of safety observations coming back. That's green on the stoplight analysis. But what seems to be somewhere in the middle as a yellow flag is the ability to take action and actually close that risk down, get the dust out of the air, provide some sort of respiratory protection, get the front line engaged and actually wearing the stuff. So under this hypothesis, what would we do? What's the insight? How would we take action? Well, it looks like we're missing the engagement, experience, leadership to get the right people on this particular control technology and get it done and get that embedded. And the decisions is somebody's got to reorient the safety program to take care of that. So that's how that would play out under using leading and lagging indicators to try to go after something like the silica dust issue. With that,
yep. And I want to just add to that too, that as serious as this issue is for silica, one thing I just found out about actually is that coming out of that oral argument in the DC Circuit, unfortunately, the litigation may backfire a little bit on us because the labor unions also made a presentation in that oral argument, and they argued that actually there is a problem with the rule. The problem with the rule is it doesn't go far enough. It should have medical removal elements to it, and that is, for those of you familiar with like the lead standard and so on, if an employee is exposed over the permissible limits, they have to be removed from the workplace for a certain amount of time, monitored medically, but continue to be paid as full-time employees. And actually, the court seemed to think that might be a good idea. So we might get an order that sends it back to OSHA, sends this rule back, but actually to add to it. So we've got to deal with this. And I do want to say that we're going to continue to do these roundtables. If any of you are interested in playing a part in that or want to talk about that, Paul and I would love to talk to you. We've done these around Houston. We did one up in the Woodlands. And so we really have enjoyed these, and we've learned a lot. And I think the clients who have come to these have enjoyed it also.